Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stone Street answering your questions. They're based on Breakpoint commentaries and podcasts we've aired and short courses and articles on our website. If you want to submit a question yourself, you can email us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. We'd love to hear from you. John, the first two questions I want to deal with today have to do with contraception. The first, I'll go ahead.
What could go wrong? Two dudes. Let's talk about this.
Yeah, let's talk about contraception. Yeah, we'll talk about that, and we won't hit any tripwires or fall into any pits here. So, yeah, the first is actually kind of a call for resources, and so we'll answer that in a second. But I want to actually read the second one because it's a very compelling question. This listener says, John, love your work. A question.
Hey, wait. Read that first part again, just because we're about to jump into contraception.
Right.
People might need to hear this like 2 or 3 times.
John,
love your work. Let's say that again. John, love your work. Okay,
now
please
that
carry
John
on.
is thoroughly validated and feeling good about himself, we can go.
As we go where angels fear to tread.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, this listener says, a question with a gentle critique. You say, the stage that we now enter after separating sex from marriage and marriage from children is separating childbearing from sex. And I think this was a commentary we did about platonic co-parenting. Mm-hmm. Doesn't contraception also intentionally separate childbearing from the sexual act when we, Christians, have sought to exercise mastery and control over the sexual act for coming up on a century now, Lambeth circa 1930, which was an Anglican get-together, by purposefully denying one of sex's natural ends? Doesn't it become more difficult for us to insist to non-Christians that sex and babies are inherently connected?
Yes, it does. I mean, there's no question here that the initial way that sex and babies were separated was through contraception. There's a couple ways to say this or to think about this, and that is that it's wrong to think that culture changes just on ideas. First of all, ideas oftentimes stay in ivory towers and never really change the real world. So usually the progenitors of ideas don't actually influence many people with them. It takes some champions. When it comes to the sexual revolution, no one really took Kinsey seriously because he was kind of weird and creepy and nasty. But they took Hugh Hefner seriously and Mary Calderon, who put it into sex education and so on. But it's also the case that ideas oftentimes require some level of artifacts. And what that means is an actual tangible reality. It's easiest to see this in terms of the Protestant Reformation, where you have a idea that's at the core of the Protestant Reformation, that we don't, the idea of the priesthood of all believers, that you don't have to necessarily go to a priest in order to access God. You can go directly to God. Well, the problem is, culturally speaking, the scriptures were in Latin and most of the people were illiterate and only the priests had access to it. So it took something. It took what we call stuff. It took a artifact, which was the printing press, which then made the access to the scriptures that much more available and cheaper. The same thing is the case here. I often put it this way. If you kind of think of sex, marriage, and babies being kind of this God-given triangle. The first stage of the sexual revolution was to want sex without marriage. But the only way to make that possible is to have sex without babies. So to have sex without marriage, you had to be able to have sex without babies. Otherwise, you have things like shotgun weddings and things like that. And then that proceeded on from sex without marriage to sex without babies to, babies without marriage and marriage without babies. And now we want babies without sex. So that's kind of the way this whole progression goes. Now, I will say that when it comes to contraception, that one of the things we need to look at is how do you keep something that could have, could be used for good from also being used for bad. Now, this past week, we did a Breakpoint commentary on psychedelics, and I'm in a really interesting text conversation because psychedelics, I'm talking about magic mushrooms, which Oregon actually legalized, and the city of Denver and the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan. They actually show some really remarkable use when it comes to treating depression and PTSD. Same thing, we could talk about medical marijuana as well, or at least CBD. The problem is that so often this is used as a kind of, well, if it's harmless over there, it's harmless in general. And and in terms of helping someone deal with depression or some sort of mental illness, hey, let's let us all deal with, the life that we don't want to live, or, let's make it, legal recreationally. When Lambeth in around 1930 legalized, or, made the Anglicans kind of the first Protestant denomination to embrace birth control. If you go back and look at that, the language of it was much more about women's health. It was much more about the way that contraception could help particularly vulnerable and women in really hard situations. Obviously, it wasn't used that way. Contraception then became the way that the sexual revolution went forward, and so on. Now, the other approach to this, which we haven't talked about, which we can get into next, Shane, if you want, is, well, let's just talk theologically about. We've talked about the way culture has proceeded and this kind of God-given natural triangle of sex, marriage, and babies being a package deal. But, listen, God gives us all kinds of mastery over the universe around us. He gives us the ability to, to heal and to create and to innovate and to fly and all kinds of things. Is contraception theologically problematic? And that's the next place we got to go in this conversation.
There is an excellent video that came out a few years ago from Mark Regnerus in the University of Texas at Austin about the power of the pill and how it revolutionized relations between the sexes and our view of sex. And it's based on the observation that in a traditional sexual marketplace, if you want to put it in those terms, economic terms, women hold the primary power. Women are the gatekeepers to sex. And that there's a very good reason for that, because women pay the heftiest price by far for sex in the form of bearing children, right? They have to carry a child for 9 months, give birth, and are intimately tied with that child for years and years to come. And so we need a mechanism that ties men and women together. And marriage was the solution for that. Marriage was the price that men paid in crude economic terms for sex. Obviously, he's not saying that that's all there is to it. But just from an economic, sociological perspective, that is how the arrangement worked. The pill changed all that because the pill made sex cheap for women as well, at least in theory. The result was that women could enter the marketplace of sex like men. Now, that may sound good to a sexual revolutionary. The problem is it put men in power of sex and made men the gatekeepers. So now men can give as little as they want in order to get as much sex as they want, and women are sort of at a loss to find men who are willing to even commit to settle down. The reason those shotgun weddings happened was because there's an innate social consciousness in a traditional society of the immense weight of what sex brings about, of the fact that children result from sex. I mean, there's a movie, it's the Nativity Story. We're coming up on Christmas here, on Advent at least, and there's that Nativity story about the Holy Family from a few years ago, where Mary's father Joachim tells Joseph, you're now Mary's husband in all except that which leads to family, that which leads to children. That's the euphemism they used. And that's exactly what sex is, naturally, that which leads to family. However, the pill changes all that. And so what has been the result of that change in mindset, where now men and women can basically behave the same? Well, we don't have to guess. I mean, Regnerus points it out. It's that we are deeply unhappy and fractured, and feeling, women in particular, feel very much used, because they absolutely are. So there's, on the one level, there is the theological argument we could make, like the natural law argument. And Catholics have done a great job of articulating the moral reasoning for why it's wrong to separate, one of the two ends of sex out from the other and just sort of make it a recreational enterprise, right? But there's a much more practical point to be made, John, and I think you were hinting at it earlier here. And that is that contraception promotes a child-free mindset. Contraception changes the way we see not just sex, but the sexes, the way we see one another, the way we see the purpose of marriage. Contraception, I'll be so bold as to say this, contraception is a key and indispensable foundation that led the way to gay marriage. How? Because because gay people don't need contraception. It did so because contraception changed the way heterosexuals thought about sex. We began to see it as companionate, purely in terms of self-actualization and fulfillment, and that paved the way to redefining marriage.
Well, let me just make a quick clarification there. Artificial contraception did, right? I mean, the idea of timing and the natural processes.
Sure, we're talking about that. We're talking about
artificial contraception. I mean, contraception itself just strictly means having sex with an intent or trying to take some steps,
right,
in order not to have children. So, kind of natural family planning. That's nothing new. Like this. When we talk about contraception, that's been around for a while. The other thing I think it's important to realize is that you don't get same-sex marriage from contraception without a lot of other factors.
Sure.
You also don't get it without contraception, right? So in artificial contraception, in other words,
necessary but not sufficient.
It's necessary but not sufficient. And if you go to Mark's video, which is from the Austin Institute, and we'll link to this at breakpoint.org. It's called The Economics of Sex. And if you Google this, Google it carefully because some interesting things could pop up. The Economics of Sex is that fundamentally in this, of the way this social marketplace of sex has worked, is that there's another social marketplace, which is the marketplace for companionship, that women want that sort of relational security that men can bring, and that women need in terms of emotionally. And I don't mean like every woman needs to be married, but this is what Mark is pointing out, and it works out data-wise. But the other key idea of the sexual revolution, Shane, was that men and women are interchangeable. In other words, there's no distinct differences from men and women. And that started out in things like roles and rights, and now has gone on to just fundamentally that there's really no such thing as male or female per se. The data that Mark and the Austin Institute point out in that video about the role that the sexual marketplace has played in mating, and the role that artificial contraception has played in the sexual marketplace, is built on something that's obvious if you look behind the surface. And that is that men and women are fundamentally different, with different needs, different capacities, different roles in society, and so on. Mm-hmm. And some of these are legitimate and some of these are illegitimate, but the idea that men and women are fully interchangeable doesn't match reality. In other words, that's another thing that needed to be chipped away. I do think, though, it's probably worth us having this conversation, though, in terms of the theological approach, which is, what does God allow us? First of all, we can say that sex, marriage, and babies were created by God as a package deal. It's the cultural commission from the very beginning. So anything that starts to divorce those components is a result of the fall. It's not the part of the created norm. The second thing is any artificial contraception that is an abortifacient, which of course now that's often used. The word contraception is used to refer to things like the morning after pill, which somewhat the jury's still out about whether that is an abortifacient, or Ella, or which is the week after pill. And then of course you've got just the potential of much normal contraceptive pills, medical contraception, to make the uterus an inhospitable place for a fertilized egg. And of course, the idea is if life begins at conception, then that sense, the pill could actually be an abortifacient. That again, this is there's a lot of evidence that points to this, but it's not something that everyone would agree on. The idea, though, of limiting conception itself, I think is allowable in a Christian worldview, and that's not something we're going to get emails on this from people who, both Protestants and Catholics, who see differently. And that's because I don't see marriage itself as an ultimate end. I think marriage itself is a means by which God allows people to fulfill their created purpose. And the purpose is stewardship of the creation, to be fruitful, multiply, to take the whole earth and make it look like a garden, to make the world flourish. And that's why procreation is inherently connected to sexuality and to marriage.
That's why you've told students before that if you intend not to have children, then you shouldn't get married.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, the idea of an intentionally, now, again, we're not talking about infertility, which is horrific. And by the way, the fact that it's horrific, the fact that couples experience infertility as such a deep loss tells you something about what marriage is for, right? But yeah, I tell them right off the bat. I mean, the idea, if you go back to the marriage liturgies of just a generation ago, much less the Book of Common Prayer or anywhere else, I mean, it's somewhere between like, God bless this marriage with babies to now you guys go have some babies. And that's what it's kind of at, because it was unimaginable prior to the pill that marriage itself should be intentionally, and that word's important, intentionally childless. But that's not the same thing as saying that, you know, it's never right to limit conception, to steward a particular, for example, cultural scenario. Think of our brothers and sisters facing Boko Haram or the Fulani herdsmen in Nigeria. Is it legitimate for them to limit conception as married couples in order to steward and protect the children or the families that they have? Or think about a woman's health. You know, I've spoken in enough homeschool circles to know some women are, they're built for a lot of kids. Some women are not, and childbirth is an unbelievable thing. And yeah, and so some are not. And then of course there's the financial stewardship, which, for the record, in our culture is usually illegitimate, because what we usually mean is I can't have a Lexus and have this baby, which isn't the same as like I can't afford this baby. But that could be a legitimate reason in other parts of the world, perhaps, or in other situations. So that's how I understand the conception issue. I answer this question a lot with high school and college students. And but the fundamental point that you've made, and you know, this has become a long answer because it's a long question. Mm-hmm. It is that the inherent separation of sex, marriage, and babies over the last several decades in Western culture is a cosmic shift. It is a shift of cosmic proportions. It did not exist, culturally speaking, until yesterday, and it has changed a lot.
Yeah. And among the things that it's changed is that it gives us a sense of entitlement to sex. That's another thing that is key to understand with the hookup generation,
right?
With millennials and Gen Z. There's a real belief that if a pregnancy occurs, something went wrong. There was an oopsie. There was a mistake. No, nothing went wrong. Everything worked exactly the way God designed it to work. Your false expectation that sex is for recreation, self-expression, what have you, that's what went wrong. You know, you have a disordered understanding and an entitlement mentality towards something that God designed to accomplish a purpose. There's an element of the first question I do want to read here, because we can list off a couple of resources, because this listener is asking for specific resources on building a portfolio of kind of worldview books and talks on the purpose of the family. So this person says, I want to develop a study on the theology of the family, God's structure and purpose, beginning with two becoming one flesh, sex, having kids, raising in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and what dad provides, what mom provides, etc. What resources can you point me to? So I would say, first of all, you should probably, Protestant or Catholic, you should go read Humanae Vitae. You should go read, is it Pope Paul what's the number? Is it not the second?
I think the
sixth.
Sixth. I think it's the sixth.
Six. Yeah. There's so many Pauls. Yeah, go read Humanae Vitae, the encyclical on human life, because the groundwork that's laid there for a full-throated critique of the sexual revolution and the contraception mindset is outstanding. And of course, ultimately, it's aimed at the culture of death and abortion. So read that. Check out Mark Regnerus's work. He's an excellent social scientist. He's done a lot of popularly accessible stuff, like the video we mentioned earlier on the economics of sex. His studies on this have been great, and he's got a new book out as well. I forget what it's called, but I'm going to give that a read and have him on the Upstream podcast soon. Check out Ryan Anderson as well, his work on marriage. He's a Catholic scholar, member of the Heritage Foundation. He's done amazing work, including going on Piers Morgan to get yelled at by, just everyone back before same-sex marriage was legalized. And he's excellent on this issue. Another thing I'd point you to is an article by a friend of mine, a Protestant gentleman at Mere Orthodoxy. His name's Jake Meter, and he has an article called "The Problem with Surrogacy: A Brief Sketch." And this essay is a really moving and powerful reflection on the purpose and significance of sex, of motherhood, especially, and the beauty there, and how surrogacy makes a mockery of that and exploits that. So I think all of those together really point you toward a fully orbed view of God's design for the family, God's design for sexuality, and why all of our attempts to separate out the different pieces, like you said, John, the three corners of it, are so misguided and destructive. So what would you recommend?
Those are all good. Some of those are a little bit academic and scholarly. For example, Ryan's book on marriage, what is marriage, is
Sure.
really important, but it's not translatable, to high school and college students just yet. I'm grateful for the work of Christopher West, because there's a couple places to begin here. One is kind of how culture has shifted and changed. And that's something that Mark Regnerus's work will point to really, really well. There just isn't a Protestant replacement right now for the theology of the body from John Paul II. And you have Christopher West, who's a Catholic writer who has produced some work that is helpful. So his book, Our Bodies Tell God's Story. What I like about that is he doesn't begin with how marriage has changed in culture. He goes back to the image of God. And he goes back to the image of God as special revelation, as the high, or maybe the highest of general revelation. In other words, if God reveals himself in what he has made, the human body, and the human person is the highest way that God has revealed himself, and the human body is part of that, and you can't actually ignore that. I'm going to make a confession right here on our program. And by the way, I don't want to be self-serving, but I think that a really helpful summary of some of the arguments from Ryan and Mark and some others can be found in the book that Sean McDowell and I wrote called Same-Sex Marriage. We're specifically applying it to same-sex marriage, but the approach is, before we know what is same to marriage, we have to know what marriage is before we know what's equal to marriage.
Speaking of Sean, I totally forgot to mention this, and I can't believe it because I interviewed him last week on the Upstream podcast about his new book, Chasing Love, Sex, Love, and Relationships in a Confused Culture. And this one is aimed explicitly at teens.
It is, and it's dealing with the purity question, which is a little different. Again, I mean, it's all related. So we're going to give you more resources here that you can swim, but it's trying to, and this is something we should tackle here in the coming weeks, is this, kind of critique of purity culture. And so Sean's trying to update that, I think, in terms of some of the critiques and so on. But we have spent the last 4 or 5 weeks now, I think, as a family with our daughters, who are, young teenagers, going through a series from Ascension Press on the theology of the body. It's basically a Catholic youth group curriculum. And we're correcting, I'm not a Catholic for all kinds of theological reasons, but there's just not a Protestant equivalent to the theology of the body. There's not a Protestant right now, although I would say, if we want to recommend something else, Timothy Tennant's new book, I can't remember the title of it, but it has to do with the body.
This is what happens when you ask Shane and John for resources. Just
for
FYI.
The body. That's what it's called. For the Body. Timothy Tennant. He's the president of Asbury. So he's trying to do that. But this Catholic, this Roman Catholic curriculum for high school students by Ascension Press, and I think it's just called Theology of the Body. And it is fantastic. We have had wonderful conversations with our girls. It sets it up again into God's created design. In other words, the thing that we're missing here in so much of how we talk about this is we talk about sex and family first and fundamentally in moral terms. This is what's right and this is what's wrong. As if somehow this is like an arbitrary decision that God made. Like he created the world and he's like, well, I guess I'll keep sex in marriage. But what the argument here is that in the way he's created our bodies and ourselves, he's revealed himself. In other words, this is not an arbitrary moral decision by God. We have to know what our bodies are for before we know what to do with our bodies. And to go back to T.S. Eliot. So anyway, there's a lot of good ones. We'll link them all together and put them on the breakpoint.org.
Let's hit another question here, John. And this one actually segues real nicely because it's a question about Mark Regnerus. He's not only done work on the on the sort of sexuality issue and the how artificial contraception changed the picture. But he's also done work on homosexuality, including one really infamous study from a few years ago. So this listener says, "Dear John and Co., I've followed and supported Breakpoint almost since inception, and often use info from your guys' stuff in sermons, blogs, and local newspaper opinion pieces. So thank you. That's a real great word of encouragement. Recently, I used the Regnerus study on family outcomes for LGBT couples in an op-ed in the local paper Gazette Virginian. I've received a lot of blowback from that. I need help answering it, especially about the validity of the testing method. Can you help? Glad to attach the article I wrote and the blowback if you show me where. I'm the solo pastor of a small Bible church in a small town and could really use the help." I think he needs some help with this response.
No, it's a great question. So let me set up what happened. And it's, again, this takes a little bit of time to explain what happens. The question is same-sex parenting, do they exhibit equal or better outcomes than heterosexual parenting?
Right.
And what you've got are two sets of studies. You have one set of studies that basically say that not only is same-sex parenting great, it's better. In fact, if we really love kids, according to this study, we would take all the kids we could find from heterosexual parents and put them into lesbian households, because apparently they have outcomes that are just through the roof. The problem is with these studies, and you can lump them all together, and is that these studies are self-selective. In other words, these are looking at participants that are members of upper class, same-sex, gay athletic clubs or things like that, is where they're kind of fishing for their participants. And they're basically told up front, here's what we're looking at. And to measure the effectiveness of same-sex parenting, they don't talk to the kids, they talk to the parents. How's your kid doing? Okay. So
turns out they all say the kids are all right. Kids are fine.
That's right. They all say that they're great. Now, what Mark did is that he did not go and solicit from a very small pool. So, in other words, the problem with the first group that I just talked about is very small sample size, very self-selective sample size. So it's not random. And it didn't really get at the kids. It got at the parents, what the parents, believe about themselves. All right. What Mark did is he looked at this study on family outcomes, which is a study that was done. It has been done for years, and it's not specific to this question. It's not specific to a group of people. It is a much broader, sample group.
Right.
The problem is, in other words, and it's a sample group that then is available for researchers to ask their own questions using data that's already been solicited. The problem with Mark's conclusions, which by the way came out that same-sex kids of same-sex parents don't do as well, in fact, they fare far worse, were two things. And when he published his report, he admitted both of these things. The first thing is in this vast study that just basically randomly solicits family data from Americans, there just wasn't that many same-sex parenting households. It's just a very small sample size to begin with. People don't know. Secondly, there's not a way in the data that has been ascertained to really to point out the difference, because that first group of same-sex parents is so small, to bring in all the other factors, like, is this a committed household? What does it mean for someone to self-identify as lesbian? Maybe they're, married to a man and then got divorced and now is living with a woman. Maybe it's not a committed household. Maybe it's kind of a rotating door of partnerships. And we know, for example, that with male same-sex households, partners very frequently. For females, the commitment lasts longer, but the romantic sexual tie dies. It's called lesbian bed death, so to speak. So all of these factors are brought into, have to be brought in, but it was not something that could be done given the small sample size. So he admits this up front, and Mark is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He publishes this bombshell. And immediately, because again, the conclusion is opposite of all these self-selected studies, he gets absolutely hammered. In fact, this is what's fascinating. Mark has a tenured position at the University of Texas. He was almost fired despite his tenure because an anonymous gay blogger complained. So that just tells you, I mean, it wasn't another academic.
Right.
And so that just kind of tells you the sort of grief that people get and the sort of political correctness that it's very hard to violate. All right. Now, so when I teach on this, for example, with students, what I say is, here's what we know. The best studies in terms of the most random data, a much bigger data set and so on, tells us it doesn't fare as well, but that doesn't make distinctions between socioeconomic status. It doesn't make distinctions between, how long a couple has been committed or whatever. The worst studies, again, say that everything is peachy and maybe even better with same-sex households. But the problem over here is it's a small sample size. It's not random. It's not unlike Alfred Kinsey, telling us how Americans behave sexually by studying prostitutes and prisoners. It's just not, it just doesn't get there. So what do we know? Now, this is the other interesting point of this conversation, which I'll give to our friend here, who, by the way, calls himself a wannabe Colson Fellow, which is really great. And to which I say, you don't have to want to be anymore. You can just be a Colson Fellow with us next year with 500 other people. The other thing that needs to is that there are two factors that should help us think about this that are not contested, data-driven in terms of data and studies. And that is that by far, the single most effective household situation for a child, the best predictor of their long-term success, and no other family structure comes close, is that they're raised in a home with married mom and dad. Okay. Like no one doubts that. That is just so overwhelmingly true. If you're raised in a home with biological mom and dad who are married, then the stability, the trust, the long-term, hand up that gives you is unparalleled. And here's the other thing we know. And that is that moms and dads parent differently. In other words, as Ryan Anderson, since we quoted him, often says, moms don't dad and dads don't mom. There's no such thing as parents, sociologically speaking. There's just moms and dads. So this, to me, neither of those two things, by the way, are contested. If that's the case, then that has a lot to say about the status of same-sex homes, right? Because if the single most effective place in which a child can be promised long-term success, at least statistically, and statistics aren't destiny for every individual, they're just destiny for societies, right? So if that's true, then we know that a same-sex household does not involve biological married mom and dad. And if moms don't dad and dads don't mom, we know that a same-sex household intentionally deprives a child of either a mom or a dad, right? So it's hard to see with this other data being so settled in so many ways that same-sex households are going to fare as well in the long term on all kinds of social outcomes, especially when it's not kind of a self-selective, hey, how do you think you're doing as a lesbian mom? I mean, you're not going to get kind of legitimate data, by, leading the question in that way.
Yeah. Hey, Ellen, give yourself a score here on how you're parenting, how you're doing as a mom.
I wish I could say that's not what these studies do, but that's what these studies do.
A lot of what you just said, John, in fact, all of what you just said is summarized really well in an article by Peter Wood, the National Association of Scholars, and he goes through all the complaints against Regnerus's paper. And the article is called "The Campaign to Discredit Regnerus and the Assault on Peer Review." And there really was an assault on peer review that took place here, because it wasn't fellow social scientists, it wasn't fellow academics who were really leading this charge. It was, like you said, anonymous bloggers, the press, a lot of angry activists calling for firings and inquiries and investigations, and then filling Google up with results that say Mark Regnerus's work was utterly discredited because they pointed out nitpicky things that he admitted up front about the study. So yeah, it's a good summary, and we'll link to that in the notes for the show.
I mean, the problem with our friend here who's asking this question is you can't fit all this in an op-ed, right? And my guess is if you reply, it's not going to be and that's what's frustrating. I remember, I forget why. We used to have a professor who used to write in the paper a lot here in town from Colorado College, which is a very left-leaning school. And he was kind of a Richard Dawkins atheist. And And I responded to something he claimed, and I quoted Rodney Stark. And Rodney Stark, a sociologist, historian from Baylor, was at University of Washington, and he wrote the book that I cited when he wasn't a believer. It was in the writing of this book that he came back to his Catholic faith. And of course, I know that backdrop. I quote this, and then, the internet kind of swarm around it was like, well, he's a Christian because he's at Baylor and he's not a legitimate source. So, but it's like, well, first of all, Baylor historians are actually pretty good. But secondly, you don't know the whole kind of backdrop. And it's really, really hard to kind of go through all of that in an op-ed, unfortunately. So I feel his pain, our pastor friend here, but I would say keep doing what you're doing. Keep claiming this. Keep citing good information. And maybe you'll have an opportunity to use the sort of data that we just walked through with you in a future piece.
Yeah, I think the data is on our side here. I think we really do have a very strong case to be made. And the bottom line is really that the body of evidence that supposedly exists proving the politically correct point on this is just atrociously bad. It's very its conclusion is already drawn before the data is collected.
It's a hammer looking for a nail, and it's not going to find it because, again, we're talking about gravity. We're talking about things that are observably real, like men and women. And, you're on the side right now of those who are basically looking and saying that there's actually something legitimate to being a man and being a woman, as opposed to those who are saying, we just did a commentary on this, the Harvard, I forget what it was. It was a Harvard Zoom kind of conference on maternity deaths among African Americans, and they refused to use the word mother. They used birthers, I think.
Birthers,
because not all, not everyone who has a baby is a woman.
Okay.
So that's what we're talking about, right? It's you'd laugh, except this is Harvard, right? And the sort of conclusion looking for evidence that this guy's talking about here has gone to level 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah. Well, we got time for one more question here, John. And this is a question about another plea for resources here. So this listener says, thank you very much for your conversation with Dr. Anthony Bradley. And that took place, I guess, 2 weeks ago. My husband definitely has that father wound that you talked about, but has never been able to find the guide to help him heal, that I know of at least. Now we have a 3-year-old son, and I'm having a hard time not worrying about both of them as individuals and their relationship together. Do you know of any resources for wives or moms where we can learn about supporting our boys? Thank you so much for your ministry.
Well, thanks. I love this question. And I love this question because, I have, as many people know, we had 3 daughters and we thought we were done. And then poof, 8 years later, here's a little boy. And so it's just so different. It's unbelievable. There's almost nothing like parenting a little boy that's like parenting a little girl. Where the girls were at when they were 3 versus where he's at. It's just insanely different. And it's so much fun. It's brought us so much joy. And I think that one of the things that I appreciated most about my conversation with Anthony Bradley, somebody I've known for a really, really long time, respect as a scholar, don't always agree with him, but I respect him greatly as a scholar. And the stuff he's been doing just on social media about fathering has just been so helpful. And you realize just how far we've gone as a culture away from the fact that dads matter, right? And that dads really matter. And, we talked earlier about the things that aren't debated in this whole conversation about same-sex households and heterosexual households. And one is that moms don't dad and dads don't mom. Yeah. There was one study, I think it was out of Creighton, if I remember correctly, that talked about how dads play with their kids leads to all kinds of outcomes when it comes especially to relational security.
Yeah.
And of course, they're talking about how dads play with their kids, which is throwing them in the air and risking their lives.
I literally have a picture on my Facebook of me throwing my youngest up in the air at my parents' house. And there's a meme where it shows, how dads see this. And it was the kid's barely in the air, and then it said how the kid sees it, and he's like twice as high, and then it's how the mom sees it, and he's like 6 stories up in the air.
But it's such a cool thing. I will point to a book that I actually think is really, really good, and which is Dr. Dobson's, Jim Dobson's book, Bringing Up Boys.
Yep, I was going to recommend that one.
It really is that good. And I mean, you can look, for example, at the idea of the father wound and all that sort of stuff is John, really was put into place by John Eldridge and Wild at Heart. And I mean, here's the thing is I wouldn't, especially since we're talking about, the next generation down, focus on the father wounds part of this. I focus on what dads bring, because the idea here is that boys can be incredibly resilient. Boys can develop into the sort of characteristics that God has given them to make things bigger and better, to fight for what's true, things like that. And there's just a uniqueness that comes out of the relationship with the dad.
I feel like you're about to break into a
flows.
John Mayer song here, John.
Well, I mean, that part's true too, relationally, but it's far more than just the romantic side of things. I almost think like have a little faith in that process with dads and their sons. It's not a straight line. It's not like a relational, how well it is by how well they're getting along, or they haven't argued about. I mean, it's just not the same thing as a kind of a mom's relationship with a daughter, at least not in our experience. Sometimes it ebbs and flows, and working together, accomplishing something together. The point of the interview with Anthony that I appreciated the most was this idea of joy. And joy for guys oftentimes comes from accomplishment, not from kind of a relational harmony. And again, I'm using general stereotypes, what tends to be true for women and men. Women have a sense of joy in certain contexts because of a meaningful interaction, a eye to eyeball, and so on and so on. Men get a sense of joy really out of an accomplishment, and that doesn't always go well. It doesn't all, when you're building something with your son in the backyard, he's not always using the wrench for the right things, right? But it's okay. And that whole point on joy, and that's what dads are supposed to bring. That was I thought that was a really profound point that Dr. Bradley brought out. So, yeah.
John, it's so funny that we don't need a study to prove the necessity of fathers. And we have lots of them. We have the evidence, but you see it even in our popular culture, this admission being made. We talked a while back about the more recent Disney Pixar movie Onward. The whole thing is about 2 boys longing for their father who passed away. And it's set in a really fun way, but it was just this really touching admission of the importance of a father, and then what it means for young men to grow up in his absence and become the kinds of men that he would want them to be. It's all about that. It was so cool. And along those lines, I'll add to your recommendation of James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, a book by Doug Wilson called Future Men. And he deals with the issue of taking the more annoying and rough and tumble tendencies of boys and directing them where they should go. He gives this example of when Teddy Roosevelt was apparently teaching a Sunday school one time. A boy came in with a black eye, and he's like, "What happened?" And he goes, "Well, someone was pinching my sister, so I punched him, and we got into a fight." And Roosevelt ended up giving him a nickel and saying, "Well done, son. You did good." And the vestrymen weren't happy with that. They were sort of like, "Well, you're encouraging violence." And the point of the exchange was that are there good ways to deal with violence and bad ways to deal with violence or bullies? Absolutely. And we should counsel our young men to be wise about the way they do it. But we should also recognize the good in what they're doing, in the protective instinct, in the desire to keep the weak safe from the abusive strong. All of these masculine tendencies that emerge in boys and are often misdirected by their sin natures, we should shepherd those and not crush them. And as the father of two young boys, who are constantly running into things, breaking things, and running their fist and hands and feet into each other, and sometimes into me unexpectedly, I really resonate with that. So I think those are some good recommendations. Probably get you started on that question, because it's a vital question and one dear to both of our hearts.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for today. Thanks so much for listening, folks, to the Breakpoint podcast. We'll be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. If you want to ask a question, just drop us a line on social media or email at AskTheColsonCenter at colsoncenter.org. And that's the email address. For John Stone Street and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.